kind of fall apart. When they are being presented with new foods, they have those tantrums. They might have a lot of problems chewing and swallowing food. And when they do try to swallow, you might find that they cough a lot, or they have problems, getting that swallow and getting that food down. These are the children who are very restricted with their variety of foods. And we usually ask parents and caregivers to keep a food log and list off all the foods that their child will eat. And the problem feeders are the ones who have a very short list, and it's usually less than 20. And as Kate had mentioned on the previous slide, our picky eaters typically have around 20 to 30-ish foods in their food repertoire that they will eat. But our problem feeders are usually at about 20 or less foods. These are also children who refuse certain categories of food based on their texture or the food group. So these are children who might completely avoid vegetables. They might completely avoid meats. Oftentimes we see this because meats are they're chewier and they're tougher to manage inside the mouth, and it's harder for them to break down those foods. So they'll avoid just the entire food group of meat. And just a side note on this, oftentimes parents will say, oh, but they eat chicken nuggets. We don't actually consider chicken nuggets a true meat, because it's essentially, when you think about it, it's essentially pureed chicken that is kind of packed together and then breaded. So while chicken nuggets it's great that a child might be eating it, they still are, if that's the only meat they're eating, they still are technically refusing an entire food group of meat. And these are also the children who almost always eat different foods at meals than the rest of the family, and they often don't want to eat with the family, and sometimes that's because they really can't tolerate the sight or the smell of those other foods that the rest of the family is eating. So this is how we would describe our problem feeders. All right, so I'm going to go over some red flags that you can look for in your child. And these red flags, it's not an all-inclusive list, but these are the major ones that might indicate the child could probably benefit from a feeding evaluation. So again, these are the kids, they avoid entire food groups or new foods in general. They don't like particular textures or tastes. So sometimes we have kids who will stay away from anything that we refer to as a mixed texture. So that's kind of like your stage 2, stage 3 foods, where it's like a lumpy kind of texture of food. So oftentimes these kids won't eat like spaghetti with marinara sauce, because that's a whole lot of different textures mixed together. So that's one example of some kids who don't, what that might look like for kids who don't like particular textures or certain tastes of food. These children often don't want to sit during meals. And so oftentimes we'll hear from parents that these are the grazers. So they'll pick at food throughout the day, but they'll continuously walk around the house and not really sit down to focus on food as a meal. These children might have really challenging behaviors throughout the day, especially surrounding a mealtime or a snack time. They also might have trouble sleeping through the night because they're not getting the adequate nutritional needs that they would need to sleep soundly during the night. And so if it's a child who's 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, not sleeping through the night, and they're a picky eater, that's definitely a red flag. They might also have limited play with toys. And the reason for this is oftentimes related to textures. So if a child is avoiding certain textures of foods, oftentimes they're also avoiding touching certain textures with their hands. And that kind of translates into not wanting to play with certain toys because they don't like that texture of toy. So things like bristle blocks or other balls and items that might have certain textures to it. These children also eat the same safe foods every day. So they've kind of gotten in their routine of knowing and understanding which foods are safe for them to eat, meaning I know when I put it in my mouth, I'm not going to have a terrible sensation in my mouth when I bite down on this food, that when I put it in my mouth, maybe I don't have to chew it at all. I can easily put it in, like yogurt. I can put it in my mouth and I can swallow. My tongue doesn't have to move. My teeth don't have to do any work. That might be a safe food for that child. So they'll stick with those foods and eat those same foods every day and stay away from some of the other foods that are not deemed safe to them. Kids who gag a lot during meals, that's definitely a red flag because it's telling us that they aren't able to manipulate that food in a safe manner. And if they're gagging, it could lead to some choking. It could even lead to some aspiration. And aspiration is when food or fluid is getting in their lungs. It's kind of like sometimes if we're coughing during meals and we might say, oh, it went down the wrong pipe. That's kind of what we're referring to. So excessive gagging or choking, those are definite red flags. And then as a result, they may not be growing or developing as fast as their peers. So sometimes we want to look at those growth charts from the pediatrician's office to determine, like, are they around that 50th percentile, or are they really below where they should be for their age and their height, or maybe their height is not where it needs to be either. So looking at those growth charts over time can be really important and give us some valuable information. They might take a really long time to eat meals, or again, throwing those tantrums during meals. So if you've got a 4-year-old who is sitting at the table and it's taking them 45 minutes to eat a meal, that's really, really too long. They shouldn't be sitting there for that long to eat a meal. So those excessive lengths of time, that's a definite red flag. Or at the opposite end of the spectrum, like I had mentioned before, if they don't want to sit at all during meals and you can't get them to sit longer than a couple of minutes. Oftentimes, these children will have frequent irritability and feel very fatigued. Again, that's also related to the sleeping. So they're lacking in those nutrients that we get from food, and that affects their mood and their behavior and their energy level. And certainly if they're experiencing significant weight loss or weight gain, that's a definite red flag as well.
Just to add on to some of those safe foods, sometimes a safe food is brand specific. So if a child will only eat Blue Box Kraft macaroni and cheese and other macaroni and cheeses will not suffice, that would be another red flag. And also for a lot of our picky and problem feeders, if the branding changes, so if Kraft Blue Box all of a sudden gets a new design, that can throw off some of our eaters also, because that fear of, oh my gosh, is this going to be different than what I know to be safe, is going to kick in. And so we have heard of parents who are like, well, they used to eat, mac and cheese, but now they don't because they changed the box and he doesn't trust it. So brand specific is also another red flag.
Yeah, Kate, thank you for chiming in. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I can tell you all from my own very personal experience as a parent. My son is 11 now, and he has been a picky eater since about age 3, and he has been in feeding therapy. And that's a great example. So he will only eat the Wegmans brand vanilla Greek yogurt. And we did try buying a different type. We kind of had to buy a different type when we were visiting family, and he knew in an instant it was not the same thing, even though it was vanilla Greek yogurt. he would not even try it. So that's a good thing you bring up, the brand specific. He will eat like a certain kind of chicken nugget, but he knows if like Costco doesn't have our brand of chicken nugget and we have to buy a different brand, he knows right off the bat. And now that he's older, he will eat it, but it's not a pleasant experience. So that's definitely a problem with our children when we do have to make sure we're only buying certain brands, because the taste and the texture are different across brands. And some of our kids are really in tune to those different sensory experiences, and they're very, very sensitive to that. And it's definitely a red flag for probably needing some feeding therapy.
All right, so moving on to the speech therapy section. So what does feeding and eating have to do with speech therapy? Because speech therapy is about talking, right? So there are some ways that speech therapists can help, because speech therapy includes communication, which is what we typically think of with speech therapists. So articulation, saying different sounds, and language, which is both understanding what people say and expressing your own thoughts and feelings. But speech therapists also cover feeding and swallowing as well. So why did feeding and swallowing get tacked onto the speech therapy specialty? So let's think about it. We'll break it down on our next slide. All right, so this is a little activity that I like to do with people who are like, I don't understand why you guys do feeding and swallowing. So the first thing that we're going to do, and nobody can see you, I think everybody's hidden, is that we are going to imagine that we are taking a bite into one of our favorite foods, whether that's a pizza, a cheeseburger, or ice cream even. So go ahead and imagine that. So if I had a burger, we're taking a big bite. Think about what your lips are doing. And then as we're chewing, what is our jaw doing? Is our tongue moving when we are eating and chewing? And then when we swallow, what is our tongue doing? What are our lips doing? Does our jaw do anything? So now let's say the word hippopotamus. So everybody just take a minute and just say that crazy word, hippopotamus. Okay, so our lips came together when we did the p sound, our P and our M. Our tongue is going up and down when we do that t and s sound. And then our jaw opens and closes at different degrees when we say all the different sounds. So I and ah. So if you think about it, when we were chewing our food, our lips were coming together to close. Oh, and our lips come together to close when we say our P. And then when we're swallowing, our tongue goes up and pushes food back. And when we say our T sound, our tongue goes up and touches the top of our mouth. And then, of course, we use our jaw both for our chewing up and down and our biting. And then, as we talked about, our jaw moves at different degrees, and we have to be able to stabilize it to make all the different sounds in the word hippopotamus and all the other words that we say. So really, it's using the same anatomy. So when we have difficulty with one area, whether that's, articulation, or we have poor strength or range of motion in our tongue, lips, or jaw, that's really going to impact both oral motor, so our ability to move, and the strength of our articulators, our lips, our tongue, our jaw. It's going to impact our feeding and our speech likely. So that's why they all go together. So that's why speech therapists do both feeding and speech. So we'll keep talking about it as we go. And we're going to think about how we use our tongues, our lips, and our jaw in feeding. And we're going to look at it a little more in depth. And so we call that oral motor. And that's just how we move the muscles in our oral cavity, so like in our mouth. All right, so the first thing we're going to think about is our lips. So our lips are used to help us clear our utensils. So whether we have a fork or a spoon, you should be using your lips to kind of scrape and pull that food off of the fork and put it into your mouth. Also, when we're taking a bite, we're using our teeth to break through, but our lips are kind of doing a little bit of a grabbing motion too. Our lips are also used to help create suctions when we're sipping. So I'm big on sipping out of a straw. That's usually my go-to, but that couldn't happen if I didn't have good closure around that straw so that that suction would work and so that I could create that negative pressure and pull that liquid up into my mouth. And then it helps just keep the food in our mouths while we are chewing and eating. There's other things that we do to keep food in our mouth, but our lips is kind of like the last defense. It keeps that food in there. So that's the big points on how we use our lips when we eat. Next is our tongue. This is our heavy hitter. Our tongue does a lot when we eat and swallow. So as we were pretending to take that bite of pizza or cheeseburger or whatever, or maybe you didn't know to do it as you're imagining, but when you eat lunch today, I want you to think about how much your tongue moves as you're chewing. So our tongue moves food from the middle of our mouth over to our teeth so that we can chew it. And then sometimes we get tired of chewing on one side and we want to move it over to the other side. And so our tongue does that for us. Another thing that our tongue does, it helps to collect, and I know this is going to sound a little gross, but it helps to collect all of the food that we've mashed up and it's mixed up with our spit, our saliva, and it creates a little ball and we put that ball on our tongue and it's called a bolus. And that's the ball of food that then gets pushed back by our tongue so that we can swallow it. So that's the main job of our tongue for swallowing, is it gets all that food together and then it pushes it back safely. And then finally, we use our tongue to clear our mouths when we're done eating. I mean, think about the last time you had food stuck in your teeth and you were able to just reach back with that tongue and clear it. This is really important actually, because if you think about, if we left all that food stuck up in our, up near our gums or in our cheeks or on our teeth, that's a pretty big hygiene concern. Because when food gets stuck between your teeth and it stays there for long periods of time, and it's a consistent problem, then you're more likely to get more cavities and have some gingivitis concerns. So it's really important that our tongue is able to reach back and kind of clear things from our lips and our cheeks and our teeth. All right.
Yeah, and I'm just going to piggyback here with a quick comment, Kate. So these are kids, and again, I'm speaking from experience as a therapist and a parent, but if you give your child a meal and then like a couple hours later, they're playing with toys or you're out and about and all of a sudden you notice they're chewing food, it could be because they have pocketed food down here and they can't move their tongue to clear that food out. But as they go about their day, it's worked its way out and now they're chewing it again to swallow it. So you kind of want to be on the lookout for that.
That's a great point. All right. Next, we're going to talk about our jaw. So as you probably figured out, we use our jaw to help us bite into our food and for chewing it. A lot of our kids, we think, oh yeah, they can chew. But then when we really look into how broken down the food is that they chew, they're not chewing it well enough. And there's big chunks. So we really need to check in to make sure that the jaw is really able to support and sustain sufficient chewing so that we really can get a good breakdown of that food so that it's safe for swallowing. And plus, chewing is an important step in the digestive process. It really helps with that digestion, moving it as it goes into the stomach. It's easier on the tummy when food is broken down as it should be. So we definitely need good jaw strength and range of motion to help us with that step. All right, so now that we've talked about all of our different anatomy, we're going to talk about swallowing and dysphagia. And dysphagia is the medical term for swallowing difficulties. So there's a couple of different types of dysphagia that speech language pathologists can help support. So our first one that we're going to talk about is oral dysphagia. So this is a lot of what we have been talking about so far with our jaw, our lips, and our tongue. So oral dysphagia is when a child has difficulty moving and breaking down food in their mouth. So difficulty with their tongue moving it from side to side, difficulty breaking it down by chewing. Perhaps they're not able to break down some of those tougher foods like Erin was talking about. Like maybe they're okay with chicken nuggets because those are processed, but if you were to give them chicken breast that's not processed, that would be really hard for them. And perhaps they're not able to create that little ball of food that we were talking about, that bolus, before swallowing. And so the food's kind of all over their mouth and they're swallowing and it's just not clearing. And sometimes they have to take multiple swallows for each bite just to get all that food out of their mouth because they're not able to create that little ball before they swallow. And then perhaps, their lips are really weak and all of this food is falling out of the front of their mouths and they're not able to use their tongue to control the food to keep it in the mouth. Now, of course, this is at a certain age. We don't expect, infants to be able to keep all food in their mouth. We're talking about a little more developed feeder. But if they are having trouble and you do notice that they're having a lot of food coming out the front, oral dysphagia might be something to look into. All right, so if you have signs of oral dysphagia, I'm going to go through these quickly because I've kind of talked about a lot of them, but the food falling out of their mouth or drooling while they're eating, stuffing of foods in their cheeks or down below, like Erin was saying. A lot of times we'll see like a little bulge and it just kind of stays there for a while. That would be stuffing. They're putting their food over there and they can't get it back out. Sometimes they have multiple swallows for each bite. When they're done swallowing and in there, if you look at their tongue and there's just food scattered all over their mouth still, that's a good sign and indicator that they have some oral dysphagia. And then, of course, if they're trying to swallow food before it's properly chewed and they're having choking scares or they have choked, that would be a concern. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is a tongue thrust swallow. So it's also called an infantile swallow because this is the swallow that we are born with. And a tongue thrust is pretty much what it sounds like, is that our tongue is pushing forward past our teeth when we swallow instead of pushing food back, which is what a developed swallow would look like. And so a lot of times these kids haven't lost that infantile swallow and moved into that more developed swallow that we would expect. And these are also our kids who most likely have trouble like moving that food into that little ball, that cohesive bolus. And so that would also be a sign of oral dysphagia. All right, so the next area of swallowing we're going to talk about, I know it's getting a little medical, but just stick with me, is pharyngeal dysphagia. And so this is like when Erin was talking about aspiration. So this is when food enters our windpipe or our trachea instead of our esophagus. And this is a big problem because our trachea goes to our lungs. We don't want food to go to our lungs. We want it to go down our esophagus to our stomach where it can get digested and you get all those nutrients. So this is, we all have aspiration sometimes when we drink something and we say, oh, it went down the wrong pipe and we're coughing and we're trying to get it out. That's going to happen to all of us sometimes, but it becomes a problem when it happens regularly because this can lead to pneumonia. So if you think about if you're consistently putting, things that you drink or even food that you eat and it goes into your lungs and it kind of sits there for a while, our lungs don't like that very much. They don't like to have, that bacteria or different things. They especially don't like sugar in the lungs and things that are have more fat molecules. Our lungs don't like that at all. And so pneumonia is usually the reaction when we get some sugary or fatty things in there. It's a problem. All right, so how do I know if my child is having pharyngeal dysphagia? This sounds scary. Well, you're likely going to see a lot of coughing during meals, just because coughing is that voluntary response. Our lungs want to protect themselves. And so if something goes down the wrong way, it's immediately going to try and cough, get that up. Sometimes, however, kids don't have that big of a cough, which can be a little scary. But if you hear a wet sounding voice after a swallow, that's a sign that there might have been some aspiration, because our vocal cords are, right past that pharynx on the way to the lungs. And so if food goes past those vocal cords and then they start talking and your voice sounds really funny, it's probably because food or drink passed your vocal cords on the way to the lungs. And so when we hear that, we think, oh no, that sip of water might have gone down the wrong way. Also, when kids have aspiration, they might start to get watery eyes and a runny nose during meal times. This can be tricky because I know that allergies, especially this time of year, are really big, and runny noses and watery eyes are kind of a consistent thing for a lot of kids right now. But if you're noticing, hey, this is only happening when they're eating and drinking, that would be a concern. And then of course, if they're getting, diagnosed with recurring pneumonia and they're getting that a lot consistently, oh, we just recovered from pneumonia, now we have it again, what's going on? That would be something to definitely talk to your pediatrician about, because it could be a sign of dysphagia. All right, so I hope I didn't scare anybody or overload anyone with too much information, but are there any questions about what we've talked about so far? And we'll come back at the end also to check in. But if there was anything, I wanted to make sure to cover that before we moved on.
Yeah, we'll give it a minute in case anyone is typing. You can either put a question or your questions in the chat or the Q&A function. I don't see any in the Q&A right now, but we'll give it a minute in case anyone is typing anything. Okay, I'm going to move on, but we'll monitor that and make sure that we answer your questions. So I'm going to talk about how occupational therapy relates to feeding and eating and what we can do to help our picky eaters and problem feeders. So it actually all starts with posture. And this graphic here, we use kind of as a guide to make sure that kids have the adequate foundation that they need for sitting, and to have strong muscles to support their feeding, because we know that if a child cannot sit well with good posture and have strong muscles in here in their core, it's going to affect their ability to focus on the muscles in the mouth and the tongue for chewing and swallowing. So when we do evaluations here in the clinic, we actually kind of bring in all disciplines. So physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, if we need to. If we're doing an if I, as an occupational therapist, am doing an evaluation on a child and I notice really weak core muscles, that impacts a child's ability to sit well. And, they're kind of like, they're slumped in their chair, they're leaning, and it's also affecting their feeding. Then what I will do is I will bring in one of our physical therapists to take a look at that child and determine if maybe some PT services are needed so that we can make those muscles stronger, because we need a really good foundation for feeding. So pelvic stability refers to the hips. So we want to make sure, like at our hip joints and where our core, our trunk meets our leg, that we have good stability there. And then that leads to good trunk control, or our core right here in the middle of our body where our stomach is, which then leads to good neck control and head control, which leads to good jaw stability. And the jaw is the only joint in the mouth. So we need to make sure that that jaw joint is stable, which then leads to our tongue and lip mobility and those movements. So it's all very much interconnected, which is why sometimes we need to back up and we need to first make sure a child has that good foundation and the good posture for feeding. So here's a couple of photos that demonstrate how important posture is. So you'll notice in the first picture in the upper left-hand section, those legs are bent back and the feet are not being supported, and the child is kind of pushing away from the table. That shows us that they are compensating for some weak muscles in their core area. And when the feet are not in a stable position, they're not resting on anything, that can really cause kids to focus so much more on just their body and remaining upright that they can't focus on feeding. So we really want to make sure that in order to have good posture for feeding, we want to make sure that ultimately and ideally, the child's hips are at a 90-degree angle, their knees are at a 90-degree angle, and their feet are supported either on the floor or a footstool or a box. Back in my early days as a therapist, we even took phone books. I don't even think phone books exist anymore, but we used to take phone books because those were easy to stack up to the height that we needed them, and we'd wrap them in duct tape, and we could make some customized footstools for our kids. But definitely take a look at your child. If you have some concerns with feeding, take a look at their position when they are sitting down for meals, and definitely make sure that their feet are resting on a surface, because that's going to do wonders. And you can kind of practice this at home. Like if you have a bar height stool, sit on it and allow your legs and feet to just dangle without having a footrest, and try to eat food. And you can kind of get a feel for how unstable your body feels when your feet are just kind of dangling. And that's what our kids go through. So we want to make sure that we provide them with a good place to put their feet. There's a few other important developmental milestones that we look for with feeding. So we want to make sure that a child is independently sitting. This usually happens around 6 months of age. And we want to make sure that they're able to sit on their own for at least 5 minutes. If they're not able to sit on their own with good control for at least 5 minutes, they're probably not quite ready for solid foods and independent eating. We're looking for some really good head and neck control. So some good developed muscles here in the neck, and no head bobbing like this, where they just like a little bobblehead. Basically, we want to make sure that they can control their neck. And this is where tummy time is really important with infants to help build up the strength in the head and the neck. And we also look at the ability of that child to be able to bring toys to their mouth. So that is a really important milestone for feeding, because if they're not bringing toys to their mouth to mouth those toys and explore those toys, or even bringing their hands to their mouth to explore their hands, they're going to have a really challenging time bringing finger foods to their mouth for some independent feeding. I'm also going to talk about our sensory systems and what all is involved with feeding from a sensory perspective. And I could easily talk about the sensory systems for hours and hours. So we don't have that kind of time. So I am going to kind of go a little bit quickly through our sensory systems. Most of us in school learned about the basic 5 sensory systems, but there's actually 8. And sometimes people's minds are like, what? There's 8 sensory systems? So vision, we all know, is our sense of sight. Olfactory is our sense of smell. Gustatory is our sense of taste. Auditory is our sense of hearing. Tactile is our sense of touch. And then these other 3 are probably words you may not have heard. So proprioception is our body awareness, and it is the input that our brain gives to our muscles and our joints and our bones, and it helps us know where we are in space and where our body parts are in relation to one another. The vestibular system is our sense of movement. It also helps us to have good posture and be upright and understand the pull of gravity, and if I am sitting this way, or if my head is tilted, or if I'm upside down. So vestibular is our sense of movement and the effect of gravity on our bodies. And then the interoceptive system is the system that is internal to us. And this is really important for feeding because it's the system that tells us when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, when our stomachs are full, when we have to use the bathroom. And so it's a little trickier of a sensory system because it is internal. So it can be a little hard to help a child understand those sensations. But obviously those sensations are very important for feeding and eating. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth with some of the sensory systems and how these systems can impact specifically meal times and feeding. So when we're looking at our visual system, and you think about the environment that your child is in for feeding and meal times, we want to make sure that we are aware of any potential distractions in the room. So too much visual input with all kinds of shapes and colors and textures of food, that can be overwhelming for a child and kind of help them go into like a shutdown mode. Or that's when you might see that they don't want to sit at the table, they want to move around, they don't want to focus on food at all. So we want to make sure that our environment is free from these kinds of visual distractions, that it's not too busy, that the table that they're eating at doesn't have a whole lot of clutter or excess things, so that the child can visually focus on the food that's in front of them. When we talk about our sense of hearing, we also want to make sure that we are aware of what kind of auditory distractions are happening in that mealtime environment. So if you've got the TV on, turn it off. If you've got music playing, probably want to shut that down. Are the dogs barking? Is the cat walking across the table? What kind of people are talking? Is brother or sister being really loud playing with friends? So try to make sure that the excess noise can be minimized as well. Again, because we want the child to focus on feeding. We know it's very, very common for parents to put their phone and put a YouTube video. That child's favorite YouTube video is playing as they're eating. And we do definitely discourage that. Now, we also know sometimes we have to pick our battles with kids, right? Do you want them to eat or do you want them not to eat, right? And if we kind of have this learned experience that if we put this favorite YouTube video on, my child will eat. We do want to discourage that, and we work with families to try to not make that part of the routine, because all that the video is doing is it's just an avoidance thing. It's a distractor. They might be just putting food in their mouth and chewing and swallowing it, but they're not paying attention to their food. And we really want to get the child to be aware of the food and the properties of food so that we can get them to feel safer around food and want to explore food and know that eating is a pleasant experience. So we do want to try to get rid of those screens and any other excess noise that might be happening. And sometimes we don't always think about food making sounds. That can be very disorganizing to children as well. So think about the sounds your food makes while you're cooking. That might be setting your child off from an auditory perspective. Rice Krispies, snap, crackle, pop. We can't to this day have Rice Krispies in our house because that sound, my son he can't handle that at all. Think about the sound of crunchy foods when you're chewing. So for example, like last night we had vegetables for dinner. We love vegetables in our house. So a mix of broccoli and onions and peppers that were sauteed. So when you eat onions, you can kind of hear it as you're chewing. It makes a distinct sound. And that can also be really disorganizing to a child when they're biting down a certain food and they can like hear that food in their mouth as they're chewing. Not only the sound that a child is making with their own chewing, but the sound of chewing in other people can also be very disorganizing for a child. And they may not be able to tell you, hey, I can hear sister chewing her food and it's really bothering me and I don't like that. You know, our kids sometimes can't really communicate that. So instead, they have a meltdown, they have a tantrum, they're pushing their chair away from the table, they don't want to sit. So we have to kind of look at these cues that kids are giving us that are telling us, I'm overwhelmed, I need to step away from the table. Okay, so with taste, some of our kids are very, very particular to certain tastes where they avoid it or they really crave it. So the spicy, the sweet, the sour, the bitter, the hot or cold. Some kids can't have anything that's even warm. They need it all to be cold. This is also related to texture as well. Smell. We've had kids in our clinic who will have these visceral reactions to food where they will vomit if they smell broccoli, if they smell spinach. Some of those really strong smells really are too much for some of our kids, and they will have very strong reactions to it. So we want to be mindful of that, especially in our homes when we're cooking. You might not notice it as you're cooking it, but maybe your child really thinks it's a very strong smell. Garlic is another one that we hear a lot from our kids. And then we also want to take into consideration that there's certain foods and certain cultures that are being cooked that can also cause some negative responses in children too. So we want to make sure that, again, while it's a cultural thing, some kids really have some strong sensitivities to smells that we want to be mindful of and see how we can work with the child to help their systems and to help them kind of get desensitized to some of those smells so that they can ultimately participate in those really important family functions of meals and celebrations and things. Okay, and then with touch, we have those textures. So some kids have a really hard time with textures in their mouth that are too hard or too soft or too wet, too moist, too mushy. Another thing too is food that they might touch if they're feeding themselves, or even if their finger just brushes against something and they accidentally get it on their hands. What is their reaction? Is it staying on their hands? Are they constantly asking for their hands to be wiped? My son always goes through a lot of napkins during meal times because even now he can't handle when food touches his fingers, certain kinds of food. So are you going through a lot of napkins or paper towels at home? Does your child also avoid like finger painting and other messy play? That kind of is related to the red flag slide that I showed, where play skills might also be impacted, playing with different toys and things because they don't like those certain textures on their hands. If they don't like it on their hands, they're certainly not going to enjoy it in their mouth. Body awareness, again, that's that fancy word, proprioception. So that's related to the posture for sure. It's also related to, can that child actually feel that they're picking up a veggie straw to eat it? Are they using too much force on that veggie straw? And when they go to pick it up, they're just crushing it because they don't understand how hard they're being on food. That awareness to the brain is not quite getting there, that says you are squeezing that food too hard or you're being too light with that food. If you give your child a banana, are they able to hold it with the right amount of pressure, or are they squeezing that banana so hard that, oh, it just pops right out of the skin and it's on the floor? So this is our proprioceptive system that's telling us where we are in space. Not only that, but what are we holding in our hands? How are we grasping a spoon? Are we able to pick up a cup? Sometimes you might go to a restaurant and they give your child a cup of milk with a lid and a straw, but it's a paper cup, and that child doesn't have enough grasp, enough force on that cup to pick it up, or they have too much and they pick it up and they squeeze it. Oh, all of a sudden that lid pops off and there's milk everywhere. That is all related to our body awareness and our sense of proprioception. Okay, movement. So again, this is our vestibular sense. We need to have our feet on the ground so that they're not dangling. Some kids also have a fear of their feet being off the floor and not having that grounding. So sometimes if kids are sitting in a chair and their feet are unsupported, they don't have the words to say, I really need my feet to be grounded, but they might show that through some body language or behaviors. So for example, if your child doesn't like to be on swings at the playground, or they don't like to climb up steps to go down a slide, that could be an indicator that they want to have their feet on the ground, on the floor. So maybe during meal times, it's really important that they have their feet grounded because they need to feel stable so that they can focus on feeding and not focus on where are my legs, they're kind of dangling in space. And I touched upon that internal body awareness, those internal feelings of hunger and thirst and feeling full and needing to use the restroom. Okay, I'm going to do a little check-in here. Are there any questions so far with that piece?
I don't see any in the chat, but we can give a little second.
Okay.
A lot of information to take in.
Yes, we could easily talk about just the feeding stuff, Kate, couldn't we, for 3 or 4 hours? It's very complex when we break it down. All right, I think we'll go ahead and move on.
All right, so we are going to talk now about how speech language pathologists and occupational therapists work together to help support our kids with feeding problems. So we work together to evaluate. So evaluation is the first step in the process of receiving speech therapy services or occupational therapy services. And so we will do what's called an initial evaluation. So, and we will work together to do this. I just did a feeding evaluation with one of our occupational therapists at Pediatric Achievements. And this is kind of how we set it up, and this is the plan that we followed. So as the speech therapist, I took the lead in looking at oral motor, so movement of the tongue, the lips, and the jaw, chewing, and then assessing some of those swallowing skills. So I was looking for a tongue thrust swallow. I was looking to see if there was a tongue tie. We haven't talked that much about tongue ties this far. So a tongue tie is when that little attachment underneath the tongue, it's hard to say, but if you look in the mirror, you may or may not have a little one. It's okay if there's a little one. I actually have a little bit of a tongue tie, but it didn't impact me functionally, so it didn't get revised. But sometimes it can really limit the movement of a child's tongue, and they can't even stick their tongue out of their mouth. They can't even, stick it out. So a part of a speech therapist eval is an oral mech examination or an oral mechanism examination. So I'm looking to see, can you stick your tongue out? Can you move it from side to side? All different kinds of movements with the tongue and the jaw, and doing different things with our lips. And then the occupational therapist takes the lead in assessing the sensory needs of the child. How do they respond to different smells and noises and things in the room and touching? And then the general development and posture, meeting those developmental milestones, getting a lot of information from the parent. We both are. We want to hear everything. What was it like when they were, transitioning from formula or breast milk to solids, and how did it go from purees to solids? We want all of that good information because it's all very helpful in explaining what's going on with their child. And so we collaborate, we work together as the child then starts to eat some food. And we're both looking to see, how is the child moving the food around their mouth? Are they stuffing some of that food in their cheeks? Are they really breaking it down, or are they just doing a couple of chews and then swallow? And that didn't seem like enough. So we'll work together to observe and evaluate the chewing and the breaking down of food, because it all goes together with some of those sensory needs. It's really hard to pull apart one piece from the other. And then, like I said, we work together to get all the information from the parent as we go, because we might see something, we might say, oh, hey, I noticed that they're really not wanting to touch, or they're really not happy that this goldfish is on their plate. Tell me about that. Is that something that you see at home? So it's really important to gather as much information from the parent as we can, but then also from each other. I say, oh, I noticed that, our client had a really difficult time breaking down that gummy worm, or, whatever it is. And then the occupational therapist say, oh yeah, I saw that too. I wonder if it's, that poor jaw support that goes from that poor trunk support that we saw. So that's how we work together to evaluate feeding. And then, of course, we like to work together when treating as well. Lots of collaboration, because it's what's best for the child. So, of course, there are some things that only the occupational therapist will target, or only the speech therapist will target. So in occupational therapy, of course, they'll do some fine motor and grasping skills, daily living skills, processing a lot of that sensory information that Erin just went through, meeting those general developmental milestones, and then that posture and stability that's needed for feeding and other activities in their daily life. And then in speech therapy, only a speech therapist would target articulation or those speech sound developments, along with phonology. That's also lumped in with articulation and how we produce different sounds and words. Receptive and expressive language, so understanding what's said to us and being able to express our thoughts, wants, and needs. We also work with stuttering and the swallowing disorders, the swallowing piece of feeding, and voice disorders also. But where our circles overlap is what's really cool, because this is a lot of the feeding stuff. So we both help support behaviors and social skills in those development. And again, they all kind of overlap. So a lot of sensory is impacting behaviors and social skill development, but also language development could be impacting behaviors and social skills development. So it's really important to work together to help support the child in every area that they need to develop those skills. And then, of course, those oral motor skills, moving tongue, jaw, lips, and then the feeding skills that we have been talking about, working on expanding their food repertoire and having success in meeting all of their nutritional needs through a variety of foods.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of clarify that different places do things differently. And what we have found is that when we can do these evaluations together as speech and OT, we can kind of kill two birds with one stone and really look at all of the areas that the child is having challenges in. And then as a team with the parent in the room, we're discussing what that treatment plan looks like. So we're discussing right then and there, hey, this is what we're seeing, but a lot of it is more related to the speech and language piece of it. So let's just go ahead and do speech therapy first for however many months, and then we'll have an OT maybe check in later. Or we might do an evaluation and come to the result of, well, gosh, this child seems like there's a lot of sensory things going on that are really impacting feeding, and their language skills look good. So we might recommend, hey, we think that maybe doing occupational therapy for several months to address these skills is probably the best route for us to go. So that's kind of how we do it here, is we as a team, and we include the parent, kind of talk about what we're seeing, how it's impacting the child, and then which specialist might be best to treat that child. And sometimes we're recommending both too. And sometimes we're saying, let's pull in physical therapy because we really need a better core for feeding. So hopefully this visual kind of helps to understand how OT and speech are separate, but how when it comes to feeding, we do a lot together, which is why we collaborate on these evaluations.
All right, so just some things to remember is that treating picky eating or problem feeding, it's a very gradual process. So it takes about 3 years to develop a mature adult-like feeding skills in our children who aren't picky eaters or problem feeders. So we can't expect our kids who are picky eaters to, in a few months, just jump up a year's worth of progress, or be ready to go and, no longer dealing with picky feeding problems after 1 year of therapy. It requires commitment and participation in regular sessions to make the progress. We love hearing our reports from parents at home who are like, oh my gosh, you said, that maybe we should try playing with Play-Doh at home. And we got the Play-Doh and he picked it out and he played with it and he touched it, and isn't that great? And now he wants to touch his mashed potatoes. Like, there's just so many cool stories of, parents, taking ideas and bringing them home, and then just really seeing that progress grow, because Whereas we make it, 30 minutes or an hour a week with your child. You get to spend the rest of your week with your child. And isn't that cool that you have all these wonderful ideas and resources from your occupational therapist or physical therapist or speech therapist that you can use at home and continue supporting your child in developing those skills?
All right. So probably what you've all been waiting for. What can I do at home with my child? You went through all this information. Now, how can I use it and what can I do with it? So we kind of discussed already how important the meal is. And we need to create an environment that is safe and supports our child for feeding, limiting distractions, creating structure. So have the same time every single day for meals and snacks, and a very distinct end time as well. That's important. We don't want to and allow a child to graze on a meal for 45 minutes. We need a start time, we need an end time, and we need to make it consistent. And that will also help them develop those feelings of hunger and being full and being thirsty and needing to use the restroom. We also need to be good role models with positive feeding behavior. And even if we don't like a food, we don't need to show that those expressions and emotions toward our child. And this was something that I had to work on with my own child. But if it's gross for you to have them dip a cracker in yogurt and then eat it, don't show them with any facial expressions that you think it's gross and that they shouldn't. Just keep a smile on your face, keep it positive, keep it not stressful, and role model those types of behaviors for your child so that they can feel safe. The first item here so type of food relative to the time of day. Oftentimes we tend to say, oh, no, you can't have a cookie for breakfast. You need a breakfast food. But we need to shift our mindset to the fact that there is really no such thing as a breakfast food, a dinner food, a lunch food. Food can be eaten at any time. And especially for kids who have maybe low muscle tone or low strength, or just you might notice by the end of the afternoon when it's time for dinner, they're having more meltdowns. They're feeling tired. They're feeling frustrated. Like they're just exhausted by the end of the day. So the end of the day at dinner time is not the best time to try to experiment with a new food or try to experiment with a meat, a chewier food. The best time for that child might be first thing when they wake up in the morning. They're refreshed. They're energized. They've had a good night's rest. That is a great time for their first meal to give them maybe the leftovers from the night before. That is a chewier meat. That is a new food that maybe they're going to be more willing to try. Some of our kids actually experience in the morning time for breakfast that they eat more calories than they do for the rest of the day. So that is a really great time to try some of these strategies at home and to give your child some more challenging types of foods when they're refreshed first thing in the morning. Make sure that they're sitting in a chair that supports them, and again, supports their feet. Don't forget that part. Have a cleanup routine, a very consistent cleanup routine, and have your child help you clean up so that they can also understand that that is the end of mealtime. Sometimes we recommend having a safe plate. So if they have some anxiety around food and textures, you have a separate plate that is the safe plate of foods that you know your child will eat, that those are the safer foods for your child that they can manipulate and eat. So having a safe plate that is separate from that more challenging food that you're working on can be helpful. And then kind of related to that is having a no thank you bowl. So if you're trying to get your child to try a new food, say it's cauliflower, maybe your first step is getting them just to touch it or pick it up or maybe give it a kiss, but not necessarily eat the food. And if they do eat it, that's great. Praise them for it and move on. But having a separate bowl that is your no thank you bowl where they can like pick it up and say, no thank you, and put it in a different spot. That can also be helpful as well. And just backing up to the cleanup routine and like the no thank you bowl, if we involve our kids in that cleanup, there's actually a couple research studies that show that kids who participate in the cleanup and actually have to pick up the food and put it in the trash can, they actually can start consuming most of their calories of that meal during the cleanup process. Because as they're picking it up and they're maybe putting it in the trash can, they're realizing, oh, mealtime is actually over. Well, I'm going to get a couple more bites in as I'm cleaning up because mealtime is over. So having them help you with that cleanup routine can also be beneficial in that respect too, where they're getting some extra calories in that way. You also want to encourage and model some messy play, both with food and non-food items. So whipped cream, pudding, and yogurt, those are some of our favorites to use along with applesauce, which isn't listed. And then some non-food things like shaving cream, therapy putty, finger paints, Play-Doh. Those are also fun. And just playing with it. So meaning there's no expectation that a child is going to try a food. You are just playing with your food. So I know when I was growing up, I was constantly being told, don't play with your food. We want to change that mindset and we want to encourage kids to play with their food because food can be fun. And that's how we teach them that food can be safe and it's okay and kind of decrease their anxiety a little bit. Again, talking about food in a positive way with children. Have your child help you buy food at the grocery store, especially fruits and vegetables. Even if they don't eat these foods, have them help you pick them out and pick them up and put them into a bag. You want to do anything you can to help their interaction with food. Along with that is to have them help you bake and cook food at home. Again, there's no expectation that they are to eat it. So that'll decrease their anxiety, but it's just, hey, I need you to help me cook dinner tonight. Can you help me pick up these chopped vegetables and put them in the pot? So again, you're just building up their safety around food and knowing that food doesn't have to be so anxiety producing. All right. So how do you know if you need help from an OT or a speech language pathologist?
All right. So first things first, do you have a diagnosis? And has your pediatrician recommended that you or prescribed that you get occupational therapy, physical therapy, or speech therapy based on your child not meeting developmental milestones or having current feeding difficulties or other existing diagnosis? Has your pediatrician or dentist diagnosed your child with a tongue tie, a lip tie, or a cheek tie? A lot of times these all, like I said, they all work together. So it could be impacting feeding and it could also be impacting speech production. Has your dentist diagnosed your child with a tongue thrust? When that tongue pushes forward through the teeth for the swallow. And then do you have a diagnosis of dysphagia, that swallowing disorder, by a doctor? Those are all wonderful reasons to come and get some speech therapy, OT, or physical therapy. And then just a reminder of our red flags. They haven't changed. We're just putting them up here again for you to look at. Because as we went through and spoke about a lot of things, you might have thought, oh yeah, I didn't realize, I guess my child having trouble sleeping through the night, that might actually have something to do with, their picky eating. Or, oh yeah, the doctor did say that, they're really only in that 15th percentile for weight and development. Maybe that has something to do with how they're eating. So yeah, we want to make sure we put these in here again for you to look at and think about in relation to your child. And do you suspect that your child needs more support in other areas that we can help? Like going back to that Venn diagram where we overlapped, do you have concern on your own with articulation and language development, safe swallowing, other feeding skills, fine motor, regulating their emotions, working through some of their sensory needs, handwriting skills, functional vision skills? These are all things that speech therapists and occupational therapists can help support. And I apologize for kind of rushing through some of those really quickly because I know we're running low on time. And I want to make sure that we have time for you guys to ask questions if you have any. And Erin, I'll let you jump in if there's anything else you want to add.
Yeah, so we have a few really excellent resources here for you to check out. We also have a handout. It's called Top 10 Things to Try at Home. And this is what I reviewed on the last couple of slides. But if you want an actual one-page handout to have at home as reference, we are happy to get that to you if you want to put your email address in the chat, and we can send that to you through email. I also did put our email addresses in the chat. If you have any questions and want to reach out to us, please feel free to send us an email. Let me also put our office phone number on here in case you wanted to give us a call and get more information. We are, certainly available and willing to help with any questions you all have regarding any of what we covered today or any other questions. We're all in this together to make sure that our kids can be seen as early as possible, so we can make sure that they're getting the nutritional needs that they need to grow and develop. Do we have any questions? I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share. Are there any questions?
Just a reminder that I will be sending out copies of the slides, and I can send a copy of the one-pager if you want at the same time. If you
Okay.
email both of them to me, I will be glad to share. And I'll also be sending a copy of the recording. So I'm going to stop now.